Working as a waitress on a cruise, the woman was shocked to realize that the millionaire in front of her was her husband, who had died 7 years ago. She approached But first, remember to subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing incredible stories. The sun was setting over the vast Caribbean Sea, painting the horizon in hues of amber and crimson. The luxurious cruise ship, the Golden Horizon, glided smoothly across the waters, its decks bustling with the activities of wealthy passengers reveling in their lavish getaways. Among the staff rushing to serve them was Laura Carter, a 32-year-old waitress with an easy smile but a burdened heart. Laura had been working aboard the ship for 6 months, a decision born out of necessity after losing her job as a librarian. Her days were grueling, serving cocktails to millionaires and keeping her charm intact despite the condescension she often faced. But tonight promised to be different. The ship's manager had summoned Laura to the private dining hall reserved for the wealthiest clientele. "Table 17, he said, his tone sharp. "VIP service, smile. No mistakes." With a deep breath, Laura adjusted her apron and stepped into the opulent room. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the polished mahogany tables, each adorned with fine china and vases of fresh orchids. Her eyes scanned the room, and then she froze. At table 17 sat a man who stole her breath away. His tailored suit screamed wealth, and his confident demeanor fit the profile of someone who owned fortunes. Yet it wasn't his appearance that shook her. It was his face. The man was the spitting image of Michael Carter, her husband, who had died 7 years ago in a tragic boating accident. Laura's mind reeled, her heartbeat racing as memories of Michael flooded her senses. His laugh, his touch, and the haunting image of the closed casket she had wept over. He's dead. He has to be. But he's here. The man glanced up from his menu, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers. For a fleeting moment, his expression wavered, recognition, shock, but then it was gone, replaced by a polite smile. "Miss, could I have a moment?" he said in a voice eerily familiar, yet with an added undertone of formality. Laura's legs felt like jelly as she approached. She forced a professional smile and managed to stammer, "Good evening, sir. Welcome. May I take your order?" His lips curved into a faint smile, but his gaze lingered on her, as if he too were trying to place her. "I'll start with a glass of your finest scotch," he said. Nodding mechanically, Laura retreated to the bar, her mind racing. Who was this man? Could it really be Michael, alive and well, seated mere feet away? But how? And why would he let her believe he was dead all these years? As she returned with his drink, she resolved to find out. "Excuse me," Laura ventured, summoning her courage. "Have we met before?" The man's expression shifted, his smile stiffening. "I don't believe so," he replied, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, hesitation. Laura's pulse quickened. He was hiding something, and she intended to uncover the truth. The hours following the encounter with the mysterious man were a blur for Laura. Her shifts passed in a haze, her every thought consumed by the possibility that Michael, her late husband, might somehow still be alive. By the time her duties ended that night, she had pieced together a fragile resolve. She needed answers. Her cabin, a cramped and windowless space shared with another waitress, offered little comfort. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence as Laura stared at the ceiling, memories of Michael swirling in her mind. They had been married for 3 short but blissful years before tragedy struck. The boating accident off the coast of Maine had claimed his life, or so she had believed. The body recovered had been unrecognizable, identified only by his watch and wedding ring. A chill ran through her. What if the accident had been staged? What if Michael had faked his death? And why? Unable to rest, Laura began researching the passenger logs on the ship's internal system. The man at table 17 was registered as Jonathan Brooks, a name that carried no personal significance, but one she resolved to investigate further. She didn't have access to his full records, but a search for Jonathan Brooks on the public Wi-Fi revealed startling results. He was a tech tycoon, a reclusive billionaire known for his sharp business acumen and knack for staying out of the limelight. Photos accompanying news articles left no doubt. This Jonathan Brooks was the same man she'd loved and lost, or thought she had. Laura's heart pounded. If this was Michael, he wasn't merely alive, he was thriving in a world far removed from their modest life in Boston. The next day, Laura observed Jonathan from a distance during her shifts, watching for any telltale habits or mannerisms that might confirm his identity. To her astonishment, she noticed subtle but unmistakable signs. The way he stirred his coffee counterclockwise, how he adjusted his cufflinks when nervous, and the faint scar on his left hand from an old kitchen accident. It's him. It has to be. When her shift ended, Laura couldn't resist her growing need to confront him. Timing her approach carefully, she caught Jonathan alone on the deck at sunset, gazing out at the endless horizon. "Mr. Brooks," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Or should I say Michael?" He stiffened, his hands gripping the railing. Slowly, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Don't pretend you don't know me," Laura pressed, her courage swelling. "It's me, Laura, your wife." For a moment the man seemed frozen, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. Then, as if a mask shattered, his face softened and he sighed deeply. "Laura," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion, "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Her knees nearly buckled at his admission. "It is you," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. You're alive, and you let me think you were dead for 7 years. Why?" Jonathan glanced around, ensuring no one was near. "This isn't the place for that conversation," he said, his tone urgent, "but I promise I'll explain everything." "When?" she demanded, her emotions teetering between relief and rage. "Meet me tomorrow morning in the observation lounge," he said. "We'll talk. I owe you the truth." Laura nodded, though the bitterness in her heart had begun to grow. As Jonathan walked away, she leaned against the railing, the ocean breeze doing little to cool the storm within her. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Morning arrived with a golden sunrise spilling over the ocean's waves, but Laura felt none of its warmth. Sleep had eluded her, leaving her mind restless with questions and her heart heavy with dread. The observation lounge, a spacious room adorned with floor-to-ceiling windows, was quiet, except for the soft hum of the ship's engines. Laura arrived early, her nerves frayed as she awaited the man who had once been her entire world. At precisely 8 a.m., Jonathan walked in, his posture stiff, his expression a mixture of determination and regret. He held a cup of coffee in one hand and a small envelope in the other. Laura sat rigidly on the plush sofa, her arms crossed as her eyes bore into him. "You came," she said flatly, the edge in her tone betraying the storm of emotions beneath. "I owed you that much," Jonathan replied, setting his coffee on the table and taking a seat across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched, thick with tension, until Laura finally broke it. 7 years, Michael. 7 years I thought you were dead. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" His jaw tightened. "I do, and I'll never forgive myself for it, but I had no choice." "No choice." Laura's voice rose, her frustration spilling over. "You had a choice. You could have told me, explained whatever was happening. Instead, you let me grieve over a coffin that was empty, didn't you?" Jonathan's face paled, and he looked away. "The casket wasn't empty, Laura," he said quietly. It was someone else's body, a man who resembled me. It was the only way to make it convincing. Her stomach churned. Convincing for what? Why fake your death? Why abandon me? Jonathan hesitated, as if weighing how much of the truth he could bear to reveal. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. I was targeted, Laura. My work. It put me in the crosshairs of dangerous people. They wanted me dead, and they wouldn't have stopped until they got to you, too. Laura blinked, stunned. You're saying you faked your death to protect me? Yes, Jonathan replied. I couldn't risk them coming after you. The only way to keep you safe was to disappear, to make them believe I was gone for good. I thought it was the right thing to do. Her hands trembled in her lap, torn between disbelief and reluctant understanding. And what about now? Why are you here, on this ship? Did they find you? Jonathan exhaled, his expression grim. I've been on the run for years, rebuilding my life under a new identity. But recently I discovered that the threat I ran from isn't gone. They're still out there watching. Laura's heart sank. So you're saying we're not safe? That I'm in danger just by talking to you? His gaze softened. No, Laura. I made sure no one followed me here. This meeting, it's as safe as it can be. But yes, there's a risk, and I hate that you're involved again. She shook her head, her voice filled with frustration. You didn't just involve me, you broke me, Michael. And now you're back, and you're still keeping secrets. Jonathan reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to trust me when I say I did this out of love. Every decision I made was to protect you. Laura's emotions warred within her, love for the man she thought she had lost, anger at his betrayal, and fear of the danger his reappearance had brought. I don't know if I can believe you, she whispered. You'll have to, Jonathan said, sliding the envelope toward her. This is everything I've uncovered about the people who hunted me. It's not safe for me to keep it anymore. If anything happens to me, you need to take this to the authorities. Laura stared at the envelope, the weight of its implications settling over her. Before she could respond, the lounge door creaked open. Both their heads snapped toward it, their tension mounting. A man in a black suit entered, his gaze locking onto Jonathan. Mr. Brooks, he said coldly, we need to talk. Jonathan's expression darkened, his posture shifting defensively. Not now, he replied. The man's lips curled into a smirk. Oh, I think now is perfect. Laura's pulse quickened as Jonathan rose, shielding her with his body. Stay here, he murmured to her, his tone protective. As Jonathan stepped forward to confront the man, Laura's mind raced. She had stepped into a world she didn't understand, one fraught with danger and secrets. And now, there was no turning back. The air in the observation lounge seemed to grow heavier as the man in the black suit stared down Jonathan. Laura, her hands gripping the envelope he had left on the table, tried to steady her breathing. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. I told you I didn't want to be interrupted, Jonathan said, his voice calm but laced with a warning edge. The man ignored him, stepping closer. And I told you that your time is up, Brooks. You've been a ghost for too long. My employers are eager to settle accounts. Laura's heart thundered in her chest. Employers? Who were these people? And what did they want from Jonathan, or Michael, as she still thought of him? Let her go, Jonathan said firmly, positioning himself between the man and Laura. She has nothing to do with this. The man smirked. Oh, I disagree. She's leverage now, isn't she? The wife you left behind, dragged into your mess once again. Laura shot to her feet, her voice trembling but defiant. I'm not leverage for anyone, she snapped. Whatever your problem is with him, leave me out of it. The man chuckled darkly. Bold. I'll give you that. But you're in this, whether you like it or not. Jonathan's hand clenched into a fist at his side. "What do you want? Money? I can pay you more than your employers ever could." "It's not about money," the man replied smoothly. "It's about the information you stole. Hand it over and maybe I'll consider letting you walk away." Information? Laura's gaze darted to the envelope in her hand. Could it be the very thing they were after? Jonathan shook his head. "I don't have it." "Liar." The man's tone dropped, his hand moving subtly toward his jacket. Before Laura could process the escalating tension, the man pulled a sleek handgun from his jacket, leveling it at Jonathan. The world seemed to freeze, her breath catching as the barrel gleamed under the morning sunlight. "Think carefully," the man warned. "You've run out of places to hide, Brooks. Now hand it over, or I'll end this here." Jonathan's gaze flicked briefly to Laura, a silent signal passing between them. Then, with a movement so quick it seemed instinctive, he lunged forward, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting the gun away. The weapon discharged, the sound deafening in the confined space, as the bullet ricocheted harmlessly off a metal railing. "Run!" Jonathan shouted, his voice cutting through Laura's shock. She bolted toward the door, the envelope clutched tightly to her chest. Behind her, the sounds of a fierce struggle erupted. Grunts, the scrape of shoes on polished floors, the shattering of glass as something fragile toppled over. Laura burst into the hallway, nearly colliding with a member of the ship's security team. "Help!" she gasped, pointing back toward the lounge. "There's a man with a gun!" The guard's eyes widened, and he spoke urgently into his radio, summoning reinforcements. Laura barely had time to process his words before the lounge doors flew open and Jonathan stumbled out, blood seeping from a cut on his forehead. "Are you okay?" she asked, rushing to his side. "We need to move," Jonathan said urgently, pulling her toward the stairs. "He's not working alone." Her pulse raced as they ascended, the walls of the stairwell closing in. "What do you mean? How many are there?" "I don't know," he admitted grimly. "But they'll stop at nothing to get that envelope. You need to hide it somewhere safe." Laura hesitated. "What's in it, Michael? Tell me the truth." Jonathan stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "Evidence," he said, his voice raw. "Proof of the crimes these people have committed. Embezzlement, murder, trafficking. It's enough to bring their entire operation down. That's why they've been hunting me all these years." Her mind reeled. This wasn't just about him. It was about something far larger and far darker than she had imagined. "Why didn't you turn it into the authorities?" "I tried," he said bitterly, "but their influence runs deep. The only reason I'm still alive is because I've kept the evidence hidden." Their conversation was cut short by the distant sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the stairwell. Jonathan's expression hardened. "They're coming. Go." Reluctantly, Laura sprinted ahead, her grip on the envelope tightening. Her thoughts raced as fast as her feet. She didn't know if she could trust Jonathan, but she knew one thing for certain. If what he said was true, then the envelope she carried was more valuable and dangerous than she could have ever imagined. She reached the top deck, where the open sea stretched out endlessly. The wind whipped at her hair as she searched for a hiding place. Her eyes landed on a maintenance hatch near the lifeboats, partially obscured by ropes. With trembling hands, she slid the envelope inside and closed the hatch, concealing it as best as she could. Seconds later, Jonathan emerged, his pace hurried, his eyes scanning for threats. "Did you hide it?" he asked breathlessly. Laura nodded. "It's safe." Before they could speak further, the loudspeaker crackled to life, the captain's voice echoing over the ship. "Attention all passengers and crew. Please remain calm and proceed to your designated muster stations. We are conducting an emergency security drill." Jonathan's lips tightened into a grim line. "It's not a drill," he murmured. Laura's stomach dropped. The enemies Jonathan feared had arrived, and they were no longer hiding in the shadows. The emergency lights flickered overhead as Laura and Jonathan darted through the maze of corridors on the cruise ship, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors. The captain's announcement had thrown the vessel into a state of controlled chaos, with passengers filing nervously to muster stations under the watchful eyes of the crew. But for Laura and Jonathan, the situation was anything but routine. "They'll try to use the confusion to their advantage," Jonathan muttered, his voice tight as he glanced over his shoulder. "How many do you think there are?" Laura asked, her voice breathless as she tried to keep pace with him. "Enough," he said grimly. "They've had years to perfect their tactics. But we have something they don't, a way to expose them. That envelope you hid, it's our only leverage." The gravity of his words weighed heavily on her. Laura's mind raced, grappling with the impossible situation she had found herself in. Just days ago, her world had been predictable, monotonous even. Now, she was caught in a life-or-death struggle involving dangerous criminals and a man she thought she'd lost forever. Jonathan led them to a storage room tucked away near the ship's engine room. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of grease and salt. He closed the door behind them, locking it with a wrench he wedged into the latch. "For now we're safe," he said, leaning against the wall, his face drawn with exhaustion. Laura crossed her arms, trying to steady her breathing. "Safe? With armed men chasing us on a ship in the middle of the ocean. Forgive me if I don't feel reassured." Jonathan gave her a rueful smile. "Fair point." He wiped at the dried blood on his temple, wincing as the cut reopened. "Let me see that," Laura said, stepping closer. She grabbed a rag from a nearby shelf and dampened it with water from a utility sink. Gently, she pressed it against the wound. "You didn't have to do this alone, you know," she said quietly. "You could have told me the truth from the beginning." "I thought I was protecting you," he murmured. "I didn't realize I was breaking you instead." Her hands faltered for a moment, but she shook her head, pushing the emotions aside. "We don't have time for regrets. What do we do now?" Before Jonathan could answer, the sound of footsteps outside the door made them both freeze. Voices followed, low and menacing. "They were spotted heading this way," one man said. "Check every room," another replied. Laura's heart pounded as she glanced at Jonathan. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. His gaze settled on an air duct partially concealed behind a stack of crates. "Help me move these," he whispered. Together, they pushed the crates aside, revealing a narrow opening just large enough for them to crawl through. Jonathan climbed in first, then reached back to help Laura. The confined space was stifling, the sound of their breathing amplified as they crawled through the darkness. The duct led to a maintenance corridor that opened onto the deck. Fresh air greeted them as they emerged, the ocean breeze a stark contrast to the suffocating tension. "We need to get to the envelope," Jonathan said. "If they find it before we do, everything's lost." Laura nodded, her resolve hardening. "This way." She led him to the lifeboats, her eyes scanning for the maintenance hatch where she had hidden the envelope. But as they approached, her stomach dropped. The hatch was open, the ropes tossed aside. "They found it," she whispered, dread seeping into her voice. Jonathan swore under his breath, his fists clenching. "They can't have gone far." The distant sound of an engine roaring to life drew their attention. Jonathan pointed toward the stern, where a small speedboat was being lowered into the water. "There!" he shouted. Without hesitation, they ran, weaving through startled passengers and crew. Laura's legs burned, but she pushed herself harder, fueled by adrenaline and determination. As they reached the edge of the deck, Jonathan grabbed a nearby life preserver and leapt into the water below. Laura hesitated for only a moment before following, the icy shock of the ocean stealing her breath. The speedboat was already pulling away, but Jonathan swam with powerful strokes, his focus unyielding. Laura struggled to keep up, her limbs aching as she fought against the waves. Jonathan reached the boat and pulled himself aboard, grappling with the man clutching the envelope. Laura watched in awe and terror as the two struggled, the small vessel rocking violently. "Michael!" she screamed, her voice barely carrying over the wind and waves. Jonathan's strength prevailed. With a final surge, he disarmed the man and tossed him overboard. Breathing heavily, he turned to Laura, extending a hand to help her onto the boat. They sped back to the cruise ship, the envelope safe in Jonathan's grasp. The man in the water was quickly apprehended by security, and within hours, the remaining members of the criminal group were detained. Back on the ship, Jonathan handed the envelope to the captain, who promised to deliver it directly to the authorities. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Laura and Jonathan stood on the deck, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "You saved us," Laura said, her voice soft. "No," Jonathan replied, his gaze fixed on her. "You saved me." The ship's lights twinkled against the darkening sea as Laura took his hand. For the first time in 7 years, she allowed herself to believe in a future, one where the truth, no matter how painful, had set them free.